Okay, guys, hello and welcome. Thank you very much for waiting patiently. I really, really do appreciate it. I see that a lot of people are already here joining us live. So again, I really appreciate that. Thank you very much for joining us. Today is a great episode, and it is my real pleasure to talk to this gentleman. I've been waiting to talk to him for a while. So today on the show we have Sankrant Sanu, who is the founder and managing director of the Garuda Prakashan, and a writer and researcher. His area of interest includes history, religious and cultural studies, entrepreneurship, and technology. He's been actively involved in writing, consulting, and social projects. He's also written a book called The English Medium Myth, Dismantling Barriers to India's Growth. Today, we're going to talk about a host of things, including the Hindu Charter, the World Hindu Congress, and a lot of fun stuff. So again, guys, thank you very much for joining us today live, and welcome to the show, Sankranchi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, fantastic. So I really want to touch upon as many things as we can today, but let's maybe start with something that's pretty fresh in people's minds, and that is the charter. That's been the big news over the past week or so. And what was one of the big, let's say, reasoning, or one of the big motivations behind coming out with a sort of a codified kind of charter almost?
Well, I think it happened a little informally. Some of us were meeting in Delhi and having some concern that uh, there has, this is 4 years of a government that was supposed to be Hindu friendly. And we hadn't seen a lot of change on the ground, especially in terms of systematic discrimination by the state against Hindus. So we said, well, rather than just expressing angst about it, why don't we say formally exactly what is it that we want?
Yes.
And so then a lot of different people came and joined up, and then we were able to formally come up with a set of points.
Before I touch on the go on to the charter, and we can look at it point by point really quickly. When you were talking about, there was so many aspirations, and there was a lot of hope among a lot of people when the government got elected that this was going to be, uh, if not necessarily friendly, but at least a sympathetic government to sort of the problems that Hindus have been facing in their own countries and overseas as well. How, on a scale of say 1 to 10, what has been your experience like, or what do you think the average Hindu's experience has been like with the current government in terms of actually taking cognizance of these issues?
Well, I'd say, I would put it somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, I know there is a lot of Hindu groups and people who are upset because sort of the core demands that they thought, whether it's Ram Temple or other things, are still in abeyance, Hindu temples coming back to Hindus. So there's a lot of things that are undone. But that said, one thing that I will definitely give the government is that overall it's a government that's been working for ordinary people on the ground, and it's very important to recognize that. I mean, if you look at some of the schemes that Modi ji has put forward, in some senses, the left should really be celebrating it. I mean, this is like if I were looking in terms of the U.S. polity, universal health care,
Yeah.
having financial inclusion. All these are our core left projects. So, in fact, I was planning to write an article on how the Narendra Modi government is a left-wing government in all the positive ways of
Right.
what left means. So in that sense, it's been a very social-oriented government. It's been a government that's really trying to reach out to the poorest of the poor and see how they can be enabled. And of course, a lot of them are Hindus as well. So in that sense, I think it is a positive. It has done a lot of positive work, but at the same time, you cannot ignore the cultural and civilizational aspect of India, because that is really what makes India India. India is
Right.
not India is what it is because of its deep civilizational roots, and it's one of the rare civilizations in the world that actually has continuity. And one cannot simply brush that aside and rush to sort of a Western model of development, because that won't be sustainable, and it won't really bring to India and to the world what it really needs.
Terrific. So I think I'd agree with you on that as well. That it's been a bit of a middling performance, and Despite that, it again, this is my opinion. People might not agree with it, but despite that, I believe that I think the government has earned a second term, not just in terms of the cultural stuff, but in terms of the, like you said, again, the economic policies that the government has taken out and the way the government has at least tried to reach out to a vast number or a vast majority of India's population and get them out of a certain economic situation and into another economic situation. So I think on those grounds as well, I think they've earned it. So that would be, I think, my suggestion to the Nota folk.
Hmm. Yes, yes, definitely.
Yeah. So okay. So let's take a look at the charter, and let's quickly just go on it point by point, because I think it's a very well thought out document, and there's some very important points that it covers as well. So the one of the first demands of the charter is the end of legal and institutionalized discrimination against Hindus by the Indian state, which is essentially against the spirit of the equality of citizens irrespective of religious identity. And so again, ensuring equal rights to Hindus on par with others in the matter of running educational institutions with undue interference of state, removal of government control of Hindu temples and places of worship, and preserving and promoting Hindu heritage and culture. So let's talk a little bit about these 3 points that we talked about a little bit as well. So running educational institutions with undue interference of the state is an important one, particularly with the way RTE has turned out and the way it sort of discriminates in a way against, it discriminates in favor of minority institutions.
Yeah, I think I would, just starting from the top, let me give a little bit of
Sure.
context. And this is really surprising. I don't know how many people even know about this, and certainly it's not in discussion in any of the media. But India has really become almost what I call a religious apartheid state. In fact, I wrote an article exactly along those lines in Rediff. And Manmohan Singh had made the statement, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, that the minorities have the first right on resources. Now, what kind of state is it where the minorities have the first right of resources above the majority? I mean, one example of that is apartheid era South Africa, where a minority of people have all the resources, versus the majority. So the very idea that saying that the minorities have first right on resources is some kind of secular state is absurd. This would not be secularism in any other part of the world. So India has created this sort of deviant variation of what it calls secularism, which isn't secular at all.
Yes.
And I think it came about perhaps by a series of accidents, or it came about by the genesis of how what happened in 1947 and what got put in the constitution. But really, even if you look at the Constituent Assembly debates when these special provisions were being put for minorities, they were being put because the partition had just happened, and India wanted to make sure that people who were staying in India who are minorities did not feel that their rights would be taken away. So the provisions were put in place to make them feel secure, but they were never intended to give them more rights than the majority has. That would be
Right.
completely absurd. But what happened is, over a series of court judgments over the years, um, as especially because the government became more and more restrictive over over educational institutions, over private institutions, what could be done, the minority rights provision in the constitution became an escape clause where all those draconian provisions became applied only to those who had the curse of being called the majority in India,
Right.
and not to other groups, which was not how the constitution framers intended it at all. So the first demand of the charter is really to restore parity, and to say, let's go back to what the constitution intended, which is equal rights.
Right.
And let's make sure the provisions that are specifically calling out minorities holds true for all groups in India. And so to simply replace that place where it says minority by all segments of society. And this is especially true in the Hindu case, because there is no one congregation of Hindus to say that Hindus are not a congregational religion. There is no pope there that's telling all the Hindus what to do. it's
Right.
actually an enormous diversity of groups, and which are all minorities. I mean, the if you look at all the different segments, they can all be called minority groups.
Right.
Um, so to say that there is one Hindu majority versus different minority groups doesn't make any sense at all. All of the diversity of groups, whether there's the Lingayats, there was this big agitation in Karnataka. Not really an agitation, there was a political move to have them declared minority. And
Right.
again, it's really strange that in every other country, being having the same rights as the majority would be what everybody would aspire for,
Right.
right? And in India, groups are actually aspiring to be labeled minority because then they would get more rights and more
Right.
freedoms. And this itself is an absurdity, and that's really what the first demand is about.
A lot of people were saying as well that quite possibly a large part of the demand that the Lingayats are making towards being declared a minority is so that they have the freedom to manage their educational institutions the way they like. And that was a lot of people were saying that was a big part of it. And again, if that's a big indictment of where we stand today as well, right? Where in terms of you have to be declared, you have to get yourself to be declared a minority if you want to just be able to manage your own affairs.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the absurdity came to this extent that in West Bengal, Ramakrishna Mission sued the state to be declared not Hindu.
Right.
Uh, so that because the communist government was taking over their institutions, they were interfering in the institutions in terms of even in terms of hiring and firing. So there was all this draconian state control, and the only way for them to be free of it was to be declared non-Hindu. I
Right.
mean, this is an organization where the founder of it, Swami Vivekananda, delivers this address at the Congress of Religions in Chicago. About being a Hindu representative. Its name has Rama and Krishna in it, and the organization has to want to go and declare itself non-Hindu. And it so shows how absurd the situation in India has become in terms of having basic rights for being called Hindu.
No, definitely. And so coming to the second one I think is a very important one as well, because it talks about the large amount of money that comes to entities from abroad, and which is a lot of it is from institutions with ties to foreign governments and their agencies. And often there are vested interests of the agencies in India, which ends up subverting into society and fueling conflict and separatism. And we know how this kind of money is used, in religious conversion. That's one of the more blatant ways that this comes to fore. All the amount that is received by these organizations under the FCRA. And so this was one of the big ones, and this was one of the big ones that particularly appeals to me as well, because it's so blatant, and it's something that you see so more commonly now than used to be the case before.
Yeah, certainly. Sham, can I ask you to send me the link for this? There's a lot of people who are asking
Oh, sure
to
thing,
get
sure
on the
thing.
show.
I'll
Send me the
send
link.
it to you. I'll send it to you just at one moment. I'll send it to you right now, so you'll be able to share it with them right away. 1 second, let me just look it up. Okay, here it is. I will share it with you on Hangouts. If you're actually, I'll send it to your email right now, and
Okay.
you'll be able to share it over there. Just 1 minute. All righty. Okay, and there it is. Now they'll be able to, if they click on that link, they'll be able to come and join us live.
Okay, I don't see I got it yet. Did you send it on email or you send it
Yes,
on?
I just sent it to you on Gmail, so I think you
Okay.
should be
You
able
can also
to.
paste it in the group chat if you like.
Okay, I'll do that right away.
Okay, I got it.
Oh, terrific.
I'm just going to quickly tweet this so that
Terrific.
we have.
I think that's handy. The more people, the better.
That's right, absolutely.
All right. So, guys, if you are listening to me on the live chat right now, and if you're typing and participating in the live chat, make sure that if you have any questions, to send them right now. I will try and take the Patreon and the super chat questions first. Once that happens, I will try and take the other questions as well. So don't worry about that, and I will put them to Sankrantji towards the end of the show in the last final 10 minutes. So go ahead and ask the questions right now if you'd like.
Okay, excellent. I've sent that over. Hopefully, some people will join.
Okay, terrific. So yeah, so we were talking about the FCRA and how that's one of those big issues that personally speaks to me as well, and I think a lot of people as well, just because it's such a blatant one, and the brazenness has been sort of increasing over time, and you have foreign organizations that talk about religious freedom. Particularly in the US, there's an organization that talks about religious freedom, but they fail to either or deliberately look the other way when it comes to these institutions working in India.
See, one of the things to look at here is this is actually a systematic global issue, and it's not really of concern not only to India, but many other countries have also raising their concern about it. Russia has raised the issue of foreign funded not-for-profits. Israel has raised it. China has, of course, quite restrictive in what it allows. And in many ways, if you even go back and look at the US, there has been of course, the US itself has a lot of restrictions on foreign funding coming in for political reasons,
Yep.
for instance. So every country has some degree of protection around its sovereignty. And the flip side is that the US state has also used this as an instrument of state policy. You'd be very surprised some years ago when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. She actually went to India, but she didn't meet the government at all. All she met was with NGO groups.
Oh wow.
And when I read that news item, I was very surprised. Why is somebody who's a Secretary of State coming in meeting non-governmental organizations? And the reason for that is that as state policy, it was decided that one way to create intervention and impact in other countries was to go beyond the government to government contact and have direct impact through what they called, quote, civil society.
Wow.
And so this is an explicit part of sort of statehood. And what we have to realize is that um, uh, even with a lot of good intentions, it ends up subverting actual civil society. And the way it happens is that only the issues that are being pushed by foreign interests, some of them might be legitimate interests, some of them might be a less benign interests, but interests that are belonging to foreign governments and entities associated with them are pushed in India on the pretext of them being local issues
Right.
and issues of local people. And that's really where the subversion comes in, where it's people, and so that's really what the FCRA problem is. Now, one of the other surprising things is that the government of India actually refuses foreign funding in cases like disasters.
Right.
So there was a flood in Kerala, and there was a big controversy around the Indian government not accepting foreign funds. And this was actually a policy that was put in place by the Congress government, by the UPA government, that foreign funding in disasters would not be allowed. And in fact, even for NGOs, some of the restrictions, including the FCRA Act, was actually put in place by the UPA and the Congress government. So it's not really a partisan issue. What is happening is that the Indian government is refusing funds, rightly so, in disaster relief, saying that our society and our state is fully capable of taking care of the circumstances.
Right.
We don't need foreign funding. But the same thing is, and this is even when a disaster happens, but when there is no disaster, we have so much foreign funding coming in. And so the same premise can easily be applied to non-disaster foreign funding for the FCRA, because what is happening is a lot of even PILs are being filed. So you have this thing called public interest litigation that we can talk about in more detail. It's a very strange beast, because you have people who can come in and file a lawsuit directly with the Supreme Court of India And unlike other lawsuits, for instance, in tort law in the US, you would need to show harm. This is one of the basis of asking legal remedy,
Right.
is to show how you personally are harmed by something which is going on.
Right.
And what the PIL allows is that you don't have to have any skin in the game whatsoever. There can be no personal harm. You can
Right.
claim it is in the public interest for a certain practice to be shut down. And as a result, what you have is you have foreign funding that is going into NGOs that are taking different aspects of Indian society for which they have no personal stake whatsoever.
Right.
And then they are managing to subvert different parts of native traditions and native culture using those PILs, which are not being driven by Indian people or Indian groups or
Right.
even Hindu groups that have some interest in what happens in India, but simply by foreign agencies.
So why do you think the government has that strange dichotomy where when it's a disaster, then people are willing to, then the government can say that, okay, we don't need to take that money, the society and the government will take care of it. But when but on an everyday basis, there is no such check and balance on those things. Is it due to that whole claim that religious freedom, or that it's going to be called a totalitarian state or anything like that? Because you can be called that even during the disaster relief stuff as well. So why do you think there's that strange dichotomy that exists?
No, I think it's just simply a place where the law has not been normalized. I don't think there's some specific thought that has gone into why allow it for disaster, not allow it for disasters,
Right.
and why not. I mean, it's just a whole series of history where there were foreign contributions coming in. India was poor; it needed help, so then it allowed those, and then later on it saw that those did not come without strings,
Right.
that they came with agendas. So then it tried to restrict it using the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. Again, a lot of these restrictions were put in place by the Congress government itself. Indira Gandhi herself was very suspicious of some of this foreign funding coming in and what it was trying to do. So this is so while the foreign funding was coming in, the government tried to put increasing restriction because they saw that it was coming with all kinds of agendas. Um, and in the BJP government also, when it came to power, tightened those restrictions. But as you
Right.
see in the chart, the press release that was put out, despite that tightening, the funding has actually increased.
Yes.
So we are asking for a ban on this because the tightening and restriction has clearly not worked. And so we need to go back to the drawing board and say, well, if we don't accept it in disaster relief, what's the point in accepting it in non-disaster cases? And this is not a big enough amount in comparison to the Indian budget that the Indian government cannot take care of it. But what it is doing is it is causing a lot of very subversive activities in many different areas. And not only that, it's clearly funding which is claiming to act on behalf of the people of India or sometimes even the Hindus, but it is not acting on behalf of them because it is driven by other interests.
Right. So then we come to number 3, which is, in order to protect and preserve the Hindu native culture and religious traditions, practices, and symbols from unwarranted interference, not by the state and its agencies, but also from others, the group urges enactment of Freedom of Religion Act by the central government immediately. So talk to me a little bit about this one, Sankrantji.
Yes, just one moment. Actually,
Sure.
I am realizing that I might. I'm just going out of power. I'm going to bring my power cord. Just one
Oh,
moment.
okay, terrific. No worries. So, guys, again, thank you for the questions. Just remember, I'll take them with Sankrantji towards the last 10 minutes of the show. So, Katie and who else? There's a few other questions I think I see here. Saptarshi, your questions. I'll make sure to take your questions. So, the Charvaka podcast has entertained us till then. I wish I had some music playing so I could really do something.
Okay, I'm back. Let me just turn my
Sure.
video on here. 1 second. Great. You can see me?
Yes, I can see you now.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay, so about the Freedom of Religion Act by the central government, what would that entail?
So there's a lot of cases where this term is bandied about, like there's a US International Organization for Religious Freedom. And so everybody uses this term religious freedom, but we haven't actually understood what this term religious freedom is, and that there are different perspectives on what religious freedom is. There's an article on my blog people can read called The Conversion War and Religious Freedom. What
Right.
does religious freedom mean? And I've got a lot of quotes in that from different communities of the world, including Native Americans, where their notion of religious freedom was very different from how the proselytizing creeds viewed religious freedom. So, from the native perspective, religious freedom is the ability for us to pass the traditions that have been given to us by our ancestors to the succeeding generations.
Right.
So, religious freedom is the freedom to practice our traditions without interference from others.
Right.
And and there's an African scholar, Matua, who also talks about it, is that it's very strange that there's a religious freedom regime, international religious freedom regime in the world that's really about having two proselytizing faiths have the freedom to destroy others. And
Right.
that's what's called religious freedom.
Right.
So we really have to come back to ask what is religious freedom and realize that I am not saying that the other perspective on religious freedom isn't legitimate. So there is an evangelical perspective on religious freedom, and that's their perspective on it. But there is a different perspective of religious freedom that comes from the native traditions. And we cannot ignore the perspective from the native traditions and just take one perspective of religious freedom. For instance, I'll give you a hypothetical example. Let's say there is a island in the Pacific which is following its traditions, which has in fact there were reports by missionaries like this. They go to an island, it's an idyllic society, there is no war there, people are living in harmony, and they're following their own traditions. And suddenly some people come in, and they believe that their god is the only god. They want to convert everybody on the island to their god. And the people in the island say, no, we don't want this. Please, we don't want this. We are happy. We're happy living as we are. Do they have the freedom to say no to these entities coming from outside? Or sometimes those entities will take a small group of them, set them aside against somebody else, or they might take an individual, over time manage to convert them and then create conflict. So is that island entitled to say no?
Right.
No, we don't want this. And the answer, in the way the current religious freedom has been defined, is no. They have no ability to say no, because as soon as they say no, and this is actually an example that's true from Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka tried to pass a bill that was wanting to limit missionary activity, and there was a lot of pressure, including from the United States, to say that you cannot do that because it's against religious freedom.
Wow.
So it's not a hypothetical. What we are doing is, you have native communities that are living with their traditions, that are living in peace, and then you want to come in and you want to interfere in that, and you call that religious freedom. And we want to question whether that's religious freedom at all. So that's really the premise of why we've defined it that way. And so there are two aspects of it. One is in the Indian tradition, people were always free to have a point of view, to have faith, not have faith, to question faiths, to change, all that. So all of that is perfectly fine. We've never had the problem that Europe had, where when the Catholic Church controlled everything, and then when the Protestant movement arose, there was a lot of persecution of Protestants. And then similarly, when there was a Protestant king, and then the Catholics were a small minority, they were persecuted. So this is really the conflict from where the notions of secularism needed to be invented in Europe.
Yep.
We haven't had this problem. People were always free to debate and discuss and change or not change. So the what we are asking for in the religious freedom bill is not to restrict any individual from even changing religion, or from wanting to go. I mean, Islam has the same issue in a different way, where you are not actually free to say I will no longer be Muslim. So
Right.
it's a crime to renounce Islam, which of course goes against religious freedom. So in our freedom of religion bill, we want to ensure all these kinds of freedoms do remain. We want to make sure people do have the right, and if they wish to convert, they can convert. That is not a problem. The problem arises when there are warlike institutional efforts where
Right.
billions of dollars are being poured in to make people leave their traditional faith and convert to somebody else. And it's done through big strategies. You can look at joshuaproject.com. You can look
Yep.
at how it's all laid out. Every small group is targeted. Their culture is analyzed, their traditions are analyzed, their weaknesses are analyzed, and then, as I said, it's happening on a war footing. War funding
Yep.
and there are institutions that teach conversion, and there are strategies. There are sales force. It's a sales force. You have quotas. You have
Yep.
people being paid money for how many people they convert.
Yep.
So what we want to do is, we don't want to have anybody's individual freedom be interfered with, but we want to question this whole institutional conversion effort with Salesforce for quotas for conversion. And
Right.
we want to make the Salesforce illegal, because anybody is free to practice or not practice their faith, or to change their faith, but it should not be a warlike effort to destroy other people's faith. And that's one part of it.
Right. So just quickly, so in terms of that, there are already, I'm guessing there are already laws in India that maybe act toward this kind of fraudulent way of conversion. That when you create it into an industry, when there's like a Salesforce like effort of converting a certain number of people every month or every year, then there's so many of these fraudulent activities that happen, and people are either fooled, or they are bribed in a lot of cases, or there's a lot of appropriation of symbols and traditions that happen, that missionaries do. Like one of the examples is like putting up a dhwajastambh in like a church or something like that, for example. So things like that. Aren't there already laws that look after, or maybe focus on these things? Or do there need to be stronger laws, or do these laws just need to be enforced better?
See, the laws have this problem that they're only looking at individuals. So they're saying that no individual will convert. You can't incent an individual to convert based on. But that is kind of a limited view of looking at how this whole system is working. We have to look at the institutionalization of it. I think individuals should have freedom, but but institutions, it's a corporate effort. Like for-profit corporations have restrictions
Yep.
in marketing. We need to have similar marketing restrictions on this kind of activity. In fact, the corporatization of this conversion effort is what needs to be really questioned. And for instance, in a for-profit entity, you have restrictions on spam marketing,
Right.
right? But here there's no restriction of spam. You can spam anybody all the time, and because it comes under religious freedom.
Yep.
If somebody is interested in knowing about Christianity or Islam or Buddhism or anything else, they can go. I mean, the internet has lots of information. They can go find information. So we want to make it, treat it as spam. We want to treat unsolicited religious activity as spam, and monitor and restrict it based on spam.
Okay.
So that's one part of it. And the other part of it is what you're referring to, which is there's a lot of attack on native practices and traditions. Even recently, there was this whole Sabarimala case that I
Yes.
won't go into detail, but there was Jallikattu, there's been Dahi Handi,
Yes.
number of attacks. And if you trace back some of these attacks, they also relate to the FCRA funds, and also to PILs filed by NGOs that are
Yes.
being funded by foreign groups. Um, one very active, vocal, quote, feminist who was fighting on behalf of so-called women's rights in Sabarimala was Ranjana Kumari, who runs a big women's rights organization.
Yes.
Now, if you track the funding of this women's rights organization, you find that churches in Europe are funding this women's rights organization.
Wow.
So now it's very strange. Why would a church in Europe be very interested that Hindu women get a right to pray in Sabarimala? I mean,
Yes.
they regard the whole enterprise as satanic. They regard this idol worship as devil worship. And
Yes.
so, why would this church be so interested that Hindu women get the right to pray?
Yep.
Obviously, it has nothing to do with Hindu women getting a right to pray. It is to do with the fact that there is a particular legend around the temple. There is a particular faith around that temple, and if one were to able to attack and destroy it, then the faith of the local people in that institution would decrease. Uh, and so, obviously, the church is not doing it so that more Hindu women get to pray there. Uh,
Yep.
so this is what we have to realize, that there are all these forces. Similarly, it happened with Dahi Handi. There is I was in Barcelona, and there is this wonderful pyramid formation that happens there. That's a big local festival. And now the Supreme Court has restricted in India that you cannot have pyramids above a certain height. Now, this is a sport where how high you go is the basis of the sport.
Right.
It's like saying, we will restrict the Olympics, that you can only do a high jump to a certain height, and if you go above that, we'll restrict it.
Yeah.
Right? It makes no sense whatsoever. But just because there's a PIL filed, not filed by people, if it's a safety issue, the people whose children are participating would be the most
They'll file it.
interested in the safety. The people who are participating would be most interested in the safety. But again, people with no skin in the game file a PIL, and the Supreme Court arbitrarily restricts the height of this, which basically kills this as a sport. And if you look at the Supreme Court judgment, the kind of language it is used, it has complete disregard for the local tradition.
Yep.
Similarly, in Jallikattu, the notion of animal rights is used. Again, this is not happening as a bullfight in Spain. The intent is not to harm the animal at all. In fact, these animals are raised with great care, the very loving part of the family. So it's a completely different relation that native traditions have to animals, to other, to how this whole society works. And there's an ecosystem that's set around raising these prize bulls. There's a whole genetic strains that are
Yep.
preserved as a result of it. And so somebody just arbitrarily comes in using an animal rights discourse from the West and says, no, you have to shut this down, and a law is passed. So more and more people are realizing, and there's more research also, that there is a scientific value of these traditions, where the traditions that are surviving are traditions that have value for the local people. This is how they survive. And a lot of times you'll find that there's some scientific research that attacks, I remember growing up where my family switched from using ghee to dalda, which is
Right.
hydrogenated vegetable oil, because science said that was ghee was bad and dalda was good. And science said that breastfeeding was terrible, and the science was funded by milk food companies.
Yep.
And in my family, so breastfeeding was stopped because breastfeeding was terrible, and milk food was better for the child. So you have these things, and then later on you realize, no, what tradition was saying was actually true. And the same study is 15, 20 years later, it's flipped over.
Yep.
So what we want to, the other part of the Freedom of Religion Act is to say, traditions have value. They don't need to be evaluated by outsiders. They don't need to be for them to be true or not. And they also don't have to be evaluated using scripture or textual evidence, which is what the Supreme Court is using, which is again an Abrahamic way of looking at it.
Yes.
Because the book says so, it is okay. If the book doesn't say so, it isn't okay. They need to be respected in their own right. There is no authority for tradition other than the fact that the tradition itself has longevity. It is there. It's been there for a long time. And it doesn't need to be explained to outsiders on any other basis or justified. So we want for the courts to stay away from these, and for it to apply the rarest of rare tests before interfering in a tradition. Yes, if people are being killed, or animals are being slaughtered en masse, or something like that is happening, yeah, perhaps the court can intervene. But without that, without having very, very extreme actions that are being taking place, the court should stay away from interfering in these traditions, and that's what the Freedom of Religion Act is about.
Definitely, and I'm in agreement there with you as well. And with the fourth one is also interesting because it has a couple of aspects to it. So one of them, the fourth demand in the charter is, in order to prevent a repeat of the genocidal religious persecution as suffered by the Kashmiri Hindus, the group demands immediate tripartite division of Jammu and Kashmir into the three states of Kashmir, Ladakh, and Jammu. And so just looking at the first one, is it really that difficult to achieve? Because people have been asking for this for a while, but there seems to be absolutely no willingness on the government's part to do something like that. Is it really that difficult to achieve politically?
Well, I can't speak about the difficulty. I mean, I think a lot of these actions, right from the beginning, even the first one, as I said, I mean, there was bipartisan support for having equality of Hindus. Even Syed Sahabuddin noted that this kind of makes no sense, that
Right.
Hindus don't have the right in India to do what other communities have. So none of these is particularly hard. It's really a matter of focus, and people in Jammu and Ladakh have been feeling like second-class citizens in Jammu and Kashmir. There has been no chief minister, for
Yes.
instance, that's been there from anything other than Kashmir. And so there are a number of legitimate demands around there. And I'm not necessarily an expert in this particular area of Jammu and Kashmir, but I mean the demand is very simple. I mean, we need to have the other parts feel represented, and we need to make sure that there is not a kind of a government that is pushing an agenda that has taken place in Kashmir into the other regions as well. So and really, I mean, it's such a um, amazing fact that amazing, not in a nice way, that this
Yep.
whole genocide of Hindus took place in Jammu and Kashmir. That the Hindus, Kashmiri Hindus, had to leave, and they were ethnically cleansed out of Kashmir. But it's really not on the human rights issues list
Yep.
of any international forum. And even though Kashmir gets raised as a human rights issues, but the fact that the only people who have really suffered in terms of being cleansed out of where they were living are the Kashmiri Hindus, and that issue has not really been taken up. So that's something to ponder about.
Definitely. And then the fifth is the group urging an immediate complete ban on export of all types of meat and beef to lower its prices by increasing its availability in domestic market while reducing the adverse impact on the environment and eliminating social friction and law and order issues. And one of the arguments that people have been making sort of against something like this is why not use, because if the Indians don't eat the cows, then why not just use this to generate extra money for the economy by sending the sort of beef meat overseas? Why are we throwing all this money into the bin, which can be used to uplift people out of poverty? That's one of the big objections that is brought up to this claim. You often, what would you say to something like that?
Well, I think we have to look at it in the Indian cultural context. Even in the framing of the constitution, a ban on cow slaughter was part of the directive principles and restriction on this. Every culture has its own sensitivity. For instance, in the US, dog slaughter is very sensitive. In
Yes.
fact, recently, I believe there's even a law that is being passed in Congress to prevent dog slaughter for consumption. So in the U.S. Congress.
Wow.
So what is happening is that every culture has its own sensitivity. In the U.S., both slaughter of dogs and cats, for instance, for meat, or slaughter of horses has been a very sensitive cultural issue.
Wow.
So in India, we have to realize that has always been a cultural sensitivity around cattle, and what has happened as a result, and in fact, some changes were made just in the last 10 years or so, which allowed for this massive export. This export was actually not taking place earlier, and some laws were made that allowed for this massive export. And what is happening as a result is that it is actually causing social friction in India because of people are sensitive. It's like if in the US people were seeing on the highway lorries full of dogs being transported for slaughter, there would be people who would start protesting,
Yep.
right? So dogs are being transported in open carriages, and dogs are squealing, and then they're taken to the slaughterhouse. There would be a lot of pet owners. There'd be a lot of people who would be out on the streets protesting. There are already protests, for instance, against China's Yulin Dog Festival,
Yep.
where this happens. Because again, the Chinese have their own culture and they have their own perspective. The US has their own perspective, and India has its own perspective on this. So what is happening is that because of this very massive increase in export that has taken place over the last 10, 15 years, it has actually created social tension. What has happened is suddenly the price of cattle for slaughter has gone up because of the export. As a result, there is a huge mafia in play, which is now stealing cattle.
Yep.
And now, because there's a mafia in play for stealing cattle, there's vigilante groups that are trying to stop the mafia.
Yeah.
And now this is where all this lynching and all this news about that is spread. But there's a whole, you cannot just look at the tip of it without looking at all the pieces that have led up to that problem. And the pieces is that because cattle has become a commodity, which are now, and India is not, it is a place where there is, frankly, law has limited ability to regulate. I mean, if you look at the number of policemen per capita in India, it's one of the lowest in the entire world. So there's a lot of social regulation that happens, that comes into play. So if you have something that impacts the social fabric, then you end up having these criminal gangs that are roaming about, that are killing people. There was this big case where people who were reporting, they were not taking a law into their hands. They were simply reporting the criminal gangs who were cow rustlers, and they reported that. Some sadhus in UP reported that, and then those sadhus were mercilessly killed. Their tongues were pulled out, and they were mercilessly slaughtered by these criminal gangs because of reporting cow theft to the police. So what you need to do is, we need to realize that this creates a lot of social disharmony in India. And this is something that is new, that this export wasn't happening 20 years ago. Something new has come up, and this has caused, so we need to go back to the drawing board and look at that and see what can be done to change that. And this is a proposal to say, okay, why does India, which has had a traditional reverence for cattle, become the largest exporter of meat? Something is wrong with this picture. We need to go back to the drawing board.
Definitely. Then the next one is to establish the central public undertaking to be styled as a Handava Sanskriti Jeernodharan Nigam. And one of the other interesting ones when it comes to this claim as well is, again, a lot of people have been sort of doing this on their own as well, which comes to, temple restorations and things like that, and patronizing Veda Pathshalas, folk art forms, dance music and stuff like that, is how reliant should the society be on the government to achieve something like that? Because there are many grassroots organizations that are doing a lot of good work already in this sphere. So do you think that this needs to be a sort of a 50-50 by like civil society and the government? How much do you think the government should be involved or focused on something like this?
Actually, Hindu society is very vibrant. It doesn't need the government to be involved at all. In most cases, we just need the government to get out of the way.
Right. Yes, so you're absolutely right.
What is really happening in India, though, is that the government is restricting Hindu society in many, many areas.
Yes.
As we saw earlier in point one, it's restricting Hindu society from running their own educational institutions without interference. It's also restricting Hindu society from running their own temples.
Yes.
And it's taking millions and millions of dollars of donation that go from Hindus to those temples. The government is simply confiscating. It's like a special jizya tax that's only applied to Hindus, where Hindus are taxed by all the donations from temples getting confiscated. And so if the government is going to maintain the state of interference in Hindu institutions, and one of the other places where it's interferes is that there are a lot of Hindu temples that are destroyed through the invasions. They were destroyed through the Islamic invasions. They were destroyed in the Christian invasions. So these temples were destroyed. Some of them are very sacred sites, and they have never been restored back to the Hindus.
Yes.
Ideally, what we'd like is just for these temples that were destroyed to be restored back to us, and we would want no help from the government. We can take care of all of the funds that are needed for restoration. But in the event that that is not happening, we would like, if the government is going to continue to control these temples that are in the controlled by the ASI, the Archaeological Society of India, or other government organizations, then we need the government to step up and restore these temples rather than stay in the state of dilapidated state that they are in right now. And the restoration is also, when it's done of very poor quality. I mean, I was in Bhopal recently, and there's a Raja Bhoj temple, which is not very far. It has one of the biggest shivlings anywhere in the world. It's an
Oh,
absolutely
wow.
gorgeous shivling. But again, the state of the temple is bad. You cannot offer prayer there, and it's all kind of dilapidated. And these are magnificent structures. I mean, even if you look at what China has done, um, China has this terracotta warriors.
Yes.
It's got a huge, massive project to restore these terracotta warrior army that was buried. They're all in pieces, but they are restoring it to their former glory, so people can see and appreciate what that ancient Chinese culture was like. Even for the Great Wall, they have restored a segment of the Great Wall. I mean, it's a huge wall. It
Yes.
makes no sense to restore all of it, but they've restored a segment of the Great Wall where you can see the wall, how it was in its past glory. So the restoration, and in India, even when restoration is done, it's done ad hoc. It's not done with any kind of objective in mind, which is clear.
Yes.
The objective needs to be very clear. It is to so that, why is China doing it? China is doing it so that the people of China can feel proud of what their civilization achieved, and people who are visitors, who are tourists, who come from outside, can see the achievements of the Chinese civilization. So, and that is not a contrary to development. That is what spurs development, because
Yes.
when people are proud of their heritage, they feel the greater need to do something today that takes them forward. And so in India too, the restoration is to happen in a way that we are very clear. We want to restore it to, in some senses, a functioning state of past glory. Like, even when there is, like in Banaras, it's kind of silly. You have all these beautiful buildings that are on the river banks, but there is some restriction that you can't even repaint them, and you
Right.
can't do anything, and you have to keep them in the same dilapidated state.
Right.
But well, this dilapidated state is not the state of past glory, and it's not the state of the present, right?
Right.
You're kind of keeping it like a fossil, which makes no
Yes.
sense. You want to restore it to a state of glory, how it was in its glorious time, with all the beautiful decorations and all the beautiful architecture, not to keep it in a fossilized state of dilapidation. So that's the aim here.
Definitely. And this is again, the next one again is a very interesting one because it talks about expediency in granting refuge and citizenship to peoples of Indic faiths fleeing religious persecution from any country. And it's I find it very interesting because the charter also acknowledges that there are some genuine concerns that have been expressed by certain people of the northeastern states that need to be addressed in this manner as well. So is one of the solutions that somebody, I don't remember who exactly it was, but I thought I saw it on Twitter somewhere, where somebody was talking about getting these people in and settling them into various parts of the country rather than just this one northeastern pocket. And is that like more of a realistic solution, and is that something that's possible?
Well, let's start from the top here.
Right.
India suffered a partition in 1947, and the premise of the partition was that there needs to be a separate homeland for Muslims. This was why the partition happened and how the partition happened. So, so now that India is partitioned in as a separate homeland for Muslims, one cannot. And this is not something that Hindus wanted. This is not
Yes.
something that we would have liked to see happen, but this happened despite what Hindus wanted. So now that territories of India were carved out, not based on what we wanted, but they were carved out specifically as a homeland for Muslims. It kind of makes very little sense for Muslims in those places to then come to India as migrants or immigrants or what have you, and come back from there, in some senses reversing partition, but without reversing partition in terms of the land,
Yes.
right? So if you want to reverse partition, you have to reverse partition by reversing the territorial by restoring the territorial integrity. And
Yes.
you cannot have just migrants that are Muslim migrants that come back to India despite the fact that a separate homeland has already been carved for them.
Yes.
So that's really the first point. And the second point is that, but what about where will persecuted Hindus go? What about Hindus that are being persecuted, or Hindus and Jains and other people whose original whose faith originated in India? That's where they're they're sort of the original. These are the original faiths of India. I mean, Israel is not really a good example, but Israel has a sense of a right to return of Jewish
Yes.
people wherever the Jewish people might be, and they have a right to return. Of course, the Abrahamic view on these things is different from the Indic view. But the fact of the matter is that we are living in India, which has been carved out in an Abrahamic view
Yes.
of the fact that Muslims are separate people and they have to have a separate homeland, and then the remaining homeland is in some sense it has to become a place of refuge, if nothing else, for people that are Indic traditional people, that belong to the Indic faiths. So that's really what this point is, that people who are Hindus who are persecuted anywhere, and people who are Jains and Sikhs and all the Indic faiths that are persecuted anywhere in the world, should have the ability to come back to India, or to apply for asylum from India, because there is no other country that they can apply as people of. I mean, there are tens of countries that are Islamic countries in the world.
Yep.
There are tens and tens of countries that are Christian countries in the world,
Where do the Hindus go?
but we're really the only one, and maybe Nepal, that are as a majority Hindu, and we are certainly the ones where all the major Hindu pilgrimage sites are, where all the major Jain pilgrimage sites are, all the major Buddhist and Sikh pilgrimage sites are. So we really have to be act as a custodian of these faiths as a state.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And so the final demand in the charter is the creation of an equal opportunity environment for all Indian languages, ending the institutionalized discrimination that existed. This will fuel both an economic and cultural renaissance, since a large part of India's population is currently excluded from development and justice due to linguistic discrimination by the state. And this is something that you've talked about quite often, right? And this is something I'm assuming is quite close to you as well.
Yes, absolutely. What has happened in India, and I kind of, in some senses, stumbled upon this. I went to an English medium school. I went to the US and studied here, and then I was working at Microsoft. And I realized when I was at Microsoft, I went to visit the Microsoft office in Haifa in Israel, and only then I realized that the entire Microsoft development office actually operates in Hebrew.
Oh, wow.
Their PowerPoints are in Hebrew, their email is in Hebrew, all the work that is being done in Microsoft Haifa as a technical office is in Hebrew. And then I started traveling, and I went to over 35 countries to see how people are using language. And I found that every major country that is developed or is on the path of rapid growth are all using their own languages.
Wow.
If you go to Russia, they're using their own language for higher education and technology. If you go to Germany, if you go to Japan, if you go to South Korea, if you go to China, they're all using and developing very rapidly in their own language. I mean, Japan is more technically advanced than the US is as a society.
Wow.
And they've gone, if you do a search, you will find that there are so many Nobel Prizes they've won just in the last decade in medicine and in other areas. And they're doing all of their education, higher education, their research work in Japanese.
Wow.
So that's the first part of it, which is that every country that is progressing rapidly in science is doing so using their own language. The second is the myth that the Indian state is somehow pushing Hindi. If you actually look at it, might be nominally doing so, and I actually don't advocate the Indian state pushing Hindi, because my advocacy is for all languages, and this is what the point here is also, is for all Indian languages. If you look at the practice of the Indian state, it actually pushes English, not Hindi.
Right.
All of the higher institutes, the IITs, the IIMs, the AIMS are English only, English medium. The only medium you can use is English. The Supreme Court of India, you can only practice in English. Most of the high courts, you can only practice in English. What kind of law and justice can be delivered to the common people if you cannot even understand what your lawyer, your attorney is out there arguing for you?
Right.
You cannot correct them. You cannot say And if you don't speak English, you're barred from even practicing in the Supreme Court. So this is a colonial state, and it has persisted from colonial times. In fact, it has gotten worse in independence. And there might, I mean, in the constitution framers were aware of this, and they did put only a 10-year window where English would continue before it would switch over. And it kept getting extended, and in fact, it was made permanent during the emergency when most of the opposition was in jail. Is when this provision of the constitution was made permanent, that
Right.
English would become the language which would not need to be extended, but it become permanent. So English has value in India, and I'm not arguing for taking out English. What I'm saying is Indian languages must have the same opportunity as English does in India. It must have the same as somebody who uses an Indian language, and even now, most people in India is more comfortable using their own language. And so somebody who's using their own language should be allowed to practice in a high court. They should be allowed to practice in a Supreme Court. They should be allowed to argue in their own language, and the judges should be able to write judgments in their own language as well. And
Right.
this problem is much easier today than it was in 1947, because machine translation has improved, and there is so much more technology that can be put into play. In fact, my prediction is that English will actually decline as an international language over the next 10 to 20 years,
Oh,
even
wow.
for tourism, because automatic translation will get to a point where you can go and you'll speak Japanese and German, and the Germans will understand German, and the Germans will speak back, and the Japanese will hear it in Japanese.
Wow.
The automatic translation it's already there. There are already devices
Yeah.
that are there, and within 10 years it will be perfected where you won't need to use English as an intermediary language at all. So English will decline, and the only force that is holding English, and to the bane of the Indian masses, is India.
Yeah.
And if we actually allow the Indian language ecosystem to flourish, we will make much more rapid progress. And this has been the case all over the world. China is now leading in artificial intelligence, in artificial intelligence research. All of their programming, all of their research, all of their teaching of programming, all of that is done in Chinese. Similarly, this has been the case all over the world. Even Europe progressed rapidly when they moved from Latin to the vernaculars. So this is a really important aspect, where if we have to restore our civilizational trajectory, if we have to restore our civilizational roots and development, again,
Right.
sometimes this is put in contrary to development. If we have to progress from a development point of view, we really have to invest in our languages for the future.
So one of the cases that a lot of people were talking about, you were mentioning Russia, you were mentioning Japan, you were mentioning China. In countries like that, they usually have the one language that they can focus on, like Russian, like Japanese. In China, they have either Cantonese or Mandarin, for example. In India, you have so many different kinds of languages in so many different places. Almost every state, you travel 100 kilometers and they speak something else. Isn't it a much harder job in India to be able to sort of tie it all together? And that's why English makes more sense, because most people, generally speaking, understand it? Or do you think the way the Russians and the Japanese have been able to do it in their own languages, India can do it despite having so many different kinds of languages?
I think the better analogy for India is actually all of Europe.
Okay.
We have to realize that India is both a country and a continent. In fact, India is bigger in population than any of the continents,
Yes.
except for Asia, of which
Yeah.
it is a part. So India is 1.5 times Europe in population.
Right.
I mean, it's stunning if you think about it. India is bigger than all of North America. It is bigger than all of South America. In fact, it is bigger than all of Africa.
Yeah.
So the population of India is greater than the population of all of Africa.
Wow.
So you cannot look at a solution in India just as one of these small countries. You have to look at it on a continental basis. And I think on a continental basis, the best equivalent is the European Union. If you look at the European Union, what happens? There is actually freedom of movement. You can travel across Europe. There is no problem. The European Union you can communicate with the European Union in any of the 24 languages of the Union. So you can email to them in any of the 24 languages. You can even make a phone call to the European Union in any of the 24 languages, and they will
Wow.
listen. So, so what you have is a central government which is actually catering to all of the languages of all of the regions. And I don't see any reason why the Indian central government cannot do this. If I'm a taxpayer in Karnataka and I need to communicate with the central government in Canada, why can I not pick up the phone and talk to somebody in Canada and get
True.
my
That's a
query
good point.
answered? If I'm somebody who's a taxpayer in Tamil Nadu, I should be able to talk to the government of India in Tamil. So similarly, if I am a child in a village in Kerala, I should be able to become a medical doctor studying in Malayalam. Now, if I want to study in English, that option should also be there. But if I'm not comfortable with English, if it's a barrier for me, why is it that the state does not allow anybody to study medical education, modern medical education in Malayalam, like they can do in Korean and like they can do in Japanese and like they can do in German or French or even Estonian?
Right.
Tiny states, tiny states are allowing this. So that is the one part. The other part is our language populations are big enough. The population of Tamil Nadu is bigger than South Korea. Why is it that the economy of Tamil Nadu cannot be as big as South Korea? So because we have very large language populations, and these languages are very rich with a lot of literary history, with a lot of technical history that we can actually build on and take forward, there is no reason why India cannot be a flourishing multilingual state. And this is how it always was. It always was a flourishing multilingual state. And there is no reason to coerce everybody into one language, whether that be English or Hindi, um, for taking India forward.
So, final question from me, and then I'll take a couple of questions from the audience finally. From my end, to now that we have a charter, now that we have a semblance of cohesion that the sort of Indic society is starting to show in being more vocal and being more organized towards its demands. What are the best ways? What are the two or three best ways in which a general person from India or belonging to an Indic society that wants to effect some changes on the ground, what are some steps that we as a society can take to get those tangible changes to happen?
I think we have to first start the discussion. So it's really, I'm really happy that we are talking about this,
Right.
because a lot of people are even unaware of the issues. For instance, nobody in the world really knows that India is a discriminatory religious state.
Yes.
Even Hindus are not aware that it's a systematic state that discriminates against Hindus. Hindus can't run their own temples, they can't run their own educational institutions. Most people are not aware of this. They call it a secular state, but it's not a secular state. It might be the only minorityist religious apartheid state in the world, but that's really what it is. It's a minorityist religious apartheid state.
Right.
And so this is unnatural. You cannot have a society progress by discriminating against the majority of its citizens, and that is not the way to go forward. So having that discussion, joining the movement, there's actually a signature campaign now being started on hinducharter.org. So people absolutely should go in, and all Hindus are welcome, because all Hindus have a stake in the Hindu society, and India is the mother of the Hindu society, and also the place of pilgrimage for all of us. So all Hindus have a stake in this. So there's hinducharter.org that everybody listening should just go right now and sign up on, and also advertise and promote this in all your groups, all your social media. We want to aim at 1 lakh signatures to start with, but there's no reason why we cannot get 1 million signatures or more,
Right.
because this is an issue that affects really all Hindus everywhere. So promote it. We're looking for funds to do advertising. We want to put advertising on all the major newspapers, so people who want to contribute, and they can themselves put the advertising. There's no central organization per se that's managing it. You don't need to send the funds to some person. You can just say, hey, I'm willing to put an ad up, and you can directly put the ad up. We can help you with the ad,
Okay.
and do that. So again, this is not one one group, one individual, anything like that. It is really all of Hindu Samaj, and everybody can act on their own and make this happen, and also pressure the government, obviously. Call up whoever in the government right from the top and say, this is something we need to get done.
Okay, so let's take a question from the audience, a couple of questions from the audience before we wrap up. So Harshit Pant is asking in the chat, how, how do we stop the courts from interfering? But I think a good way to put the question would be, I guess, how do we get the courts to maybe not interfere the way they interfere in sort of Hindu affairs and the way they leave sort of Muslim and Christian affairs alone? How do we get to a situation like that?
Well, I think we have to articulate the notion of rights of indigenous traditions, and many countries have actually done this in many different ways. Where there is a notion of sort of people of the soil and indigenous traditions, and the idea that these are rooted in India, and we need to be able to articulate rights. That doesn't mean that we deny other people rights. Everybody has to have their own rights and practices preserved, but we have to realize that the Hindu traditions, the Indian traditions are not like religions of the book. So you cannot base the authority of that based on scriptural authority or textual authority for a practice to continue.
Right.
So because of that, we need to be able to specifically articulate rights, and this is why we want the Freedom of Religion Act to be passed as an act by Parliament that says that indigenous traditions, indigenous practices have rights. They have a right to continue and to preserve their tradition and to propagate this to their children. And the court needs to use the rarest of rare tests before they interfere in anything.
Right.
So once this is part of law, then the courts will be, they won't ad hoc saying, oh yeah, we don't like the fact that dahi handi is too high, let's just ban it. It makes no sense for a court to do that.
Yeah. Okay, one more question is coming from Kushal Mehra from the Charvaka podcast asking, should Indians be forming groups and filing cases against these missionary organizations that are doing this fraudulent conversions in southern India? Is that the best way to fight these organizations?
I think I think I advocate everybody taking suitable actions that they find suitable. So I am no authority to tell people what to do or what not to do. But and in fact, I think it's really amazing how the Hindu Samaj works in this very diverse and dispersed way without having the central authority. I remember many years ago, I had written a critique of Encarta and how they depicted Hinduism in Encarta in the encyclopedia, and that conversation started. Rajiv Malhotra had written something, I wrote something, and then people of their own, other people, took up this California textbook. A suit was filed, so other people automatically got inspired, and they did various other things. It doesn't have to be centrally coordinated. Didn't have to be. It is simply a question of lighting the spark. So I've written many articles on sankrant.org on some of these issues like religious freedom. People can go and read, and people can get inspired and take the action that they think will be effective. But the most important thing we are putting forward as a Hindu charter is that we need to end state discrimination against Hindus. Hindu society can take care of itself. Hindu Samaj can take care of itself.
Yes.
But we need to end an anti-Hindu state, which is what we have right now. India cannot continue as an anti-Hindu state, nor will it survive like that.
Okay. And KT is asking, do we need an authority or a religious head or an admin body to represent and administer interests of Hindus and different sects, Indic sects and practices of different Hindu nations or countries where Hindus are present, like India, Nepal, countries in the Caribbean and stuff like that?
I wouldn't necessarily call it a centralized authority, but I think coordinating advocacy groups is definitely very useful. Okay. I'm a big believer in a decentralized model. And I think this is one of the strengths of Hindu society. And in fact, this is one of the reasons we survived, was because we are highly decentralized. Why is it that there's no other country in the world which was ruled by either Islam or Christianity for more than 100 years that was not wholly converted?
Yes.
And we are amazing at that. And one of the reasons why we did was because we are decentralized. You literally have to go into every village, and convert, which is why, which is what the agenda is right now, to get into every village and convert. Because there's not like one pope that you could convert or one king that you had to convert and everybody else would get converted. Yep. So I am actually not in favor of centralizing authority. I'm in favor of keeping our traditions local and decentralized and vibrant as they've always been. But we can do better coordination for sure, and that allows us to speak, in a one voice on issues that matter in that way.
Okay. So, final question I'll take from Babaji Ki Jai Ho, who's asking, how can we unite Hindus on a common agenda if we're not even able to communicate in a single language with each other and not able to understand each other? You touched upon it a little bit, but if you want to just answer that one last.
Yeah, so I don't think a single language. India has never been a single language nation. My very simple question: before the British came, were we talking to each other or were we not?
Right.
You find that there is huge discourse happening all over India. I mean, Shankaracharya does a yatra. He's a child in Kerala, right? He does a yatra all over India. He's had some mathas in all four corners of India. In his entire Jivani, there's a Digvijay yatra, there's a Jivani. Nowhere is it written that language is a huge problem in India.
Right.
In fact, this language problem occurs after we adopt English, is when everybody starts talking about the language problem. For that, there is no language problem. So
Right.
our languages are beautiful. We don't need to suppress one language to bring another language up. We can learn each other's languages. They're easy to learn one from the other. Once we don't have the crutch of English, even now, you go into a construction project, let us say happening in Bangalore, where there are construction workers from all over India. You won't find them speaking in English to each other.
Right.
Right. So the idea that English is linking is not true. It is only a language of a very small section of elite. And our languages are rich and beautiful, and we can learn each other's languages and follow the European Union model. What happens when a German is speaking in going to France and speaking, or in Poland? There are translators. People can use translators. People can use many other things. There is a much more diversity. And in fact, I encourage the use of more talks with translators in Indian languages. I've been giving my talk in Hindi all over the place, and I localize to the language. Sometimes even have people translating. There is no reason simply because Hindi is my mother tongue, not because I'm favoring Hindi over other languages. But people can use their mother tongue. They can ask for translators, and very soon we will have an Indian lingua franca, and Sanskrit has really been the link, if you would, in terms of vocabulary. So having that link be more revived, I think, is the way to go, rather than imposing one language.
Right, absolutely. And again, I think we'll leave the questions at that. And I want to make sure I thank you, Sankrantji, for a fantastic session today. I'm happy I was able to actually go through all the points of the charter with you today as well. I want to just appeal to everybody that's watching the show right now to go and check out, I believe it's hinducharter.org, right?
That's right, hinducharter.org.
Yeah. So if you feel about this issue, if you feel strongly about this issue, you can go and check out hinducharter.org. If you agree with these points, please go ahead and sign up. We, again, like I said, we're trying to get to 1 lakh signatures, but we would not hate more signatures. So please go ahead and check it out. Share it as much as you can. And like again, I agree with Sankrantji when he says that we don't necessarily need a one body that's controlling all Hindu affairs, but it is very, very good that different cogs within the sort of Indian ecosystem are working towards a some common goal. So I think it's very good to have these common goals out and about and openly discussing them and openly popularizing them and sharing them. So I think this is a fantastic endeavor, and I wholeheartedly support it. And I hope that it gets more press, and it gets given more heed by the politicians as well. So again, Sankrantji, thank you very much for your time. I'll let you have the last word.
No, thank you so much, Shamji. It was wonderful to talk and be able to. I don't think we've actually done a systematic interview other than the press conference on this, and I have full faith in Hindu Samaj. I mean, our Samaj is our power, and even for the language issue, yes, the state is a big obstacle. But if Hindu Samaj tomorrow decides that we want to translate 100,000 books, we can do that,
Yes.
right? So in fact, we launched a project in this publication house called Garuda Prakashan, and there's a Garuda Udan project where we want to have people come in and help translate books or help sponsor books being translated. I mean, this is a we can solve these problems. We just have to be clear that they need to be solved.
Yes, absolutely right. Absolutely right. I couldn't have put it better myself. Again, guys, thank you very much. Please go check out the hinducharter.org if you would like. I provided the links where you can go follow Sankrantji as well and follow his work. If you enjoy what we do here on the Sham Sharma show, you can go ahead and subscribe to the show's channel. If you would like to support the show, if you like what we do here on the show, if you'd like to support us on Patreon, you can go ahead and go do that as well. The link is provided in the description. I will see you guys for the next episode, and until then, stay happy, stay healthy.
Twitter at Sankrant. Mention Twitter at
Sankrant. The link is provided in the description, so make sure to go check it out as well, guys. All right, fantastic. I will see everybody for the next episode, and until then, stay happy, stay healthy. I'll see everybody soon.